All right, so we had basically just said, language that English is primary language in Canada, Quebec, French is the secondary language. Now, in the U.S., we speak English, but also Spanish is becoming a thing. Now, here's the thing: is the U.S. bilingual? No, because we're talking about official languages. Not everyone has to speak Spanish in addition in order to get around. You don't tend to see Spanish signs all over the place, although it's becoming more of a thing for pragmatic senses. Does that mean we'll become bilingual? I don't know. I've seen some people who are language people say adamantly not, and that really has to do with movement we'll get to here in a second. But basically, who knows? It's all true. But as far as history is concerned, we often refer to North America when we talk about U.S. and Canada as Anglo-America because both of these areas were settled by English people. Anglo refers to the English. Now, of course, France also had a big presence in Canada. Historically, this is because France was really interested in fur, the fur trade. Fur was what rich people wore. It was a way of accenting their clothing as well as showing off their wealth. And the softest, most luscious fur was the ones that were going to sell the best. So what happened is the French ended up settling in this area of the world, but they didn't really expand very much. New France was actually kind of small compared to New England. And that was simply because they didn't need the land. They weren't coming to this area to farm. They weren't coming to this area to settle, per se. They were interested in trading with the natives. So that's also why the French tend to have a better relationship with native tribes, or as they often referred to in Canada as the First Nations, rather than England did. So England was all about settling the land. England actually had territory that was to the south of what we think of as New York, sort of the 13 colonies area. Eventually, they went to war with the Netherlands over a territory that was just north of them. Basically, if you imagine like a map of North America, and down here is the English, up here is the French, you have the Dutch right here in the middle. We had New Netherlands right in there. Okay, so the English and the Dutch went to war over this, and the English won. So they got all of the Dutch territory. The Dutch had to just give up all their colonies, and that went to England. So the New Netherlands became New England. Okay? So all that area of New York and all that was originally there. So that puts the English and the French directly in contact with one another. So obviously there's going to be a war there because England is seeking land, whereas France is kind of seeking fur. And so it's the French and their allies, the Native American tribes, against the English in what is known as the 7 Years' War. Okay. Now we in North America don't call it that. What do we call it? The French and Indian War. Sure. And what happens is England wins, and so the same thing that happens with the Netherlands happens to New France. It has to become part of the English territory. Now, that's going to cause problems down the line, but eventually they're going to get their act together and form sort of a unified nation out of this. But suffice it to say, it's kind of a testy period. So England spends all this money on wars, and suddenly they have crippling debt. Because as you guys know, war is expensive. So they have got to raise taxes to pay for this war. There's two schools of thought about this. One is that these taxes should be spread across the entire empire. The second is that the colonists should have to pay the brunt of the taxes since they are the ones who are benefiting the most from this new land that just opened up. So needless to say, the colonists are in favor of spreading that around because they don't want to pay all that money, saying, no, this is about the glory of the Brit, Gloriana Britannia for Britain. Whereas the rest of England is like, no, let's make the colonists pay for it. Needless to say, the colonists were going to be forced to pay for this. New taxes were being raised, and the colonists were really good with this because the colonists didn't have any direct say in Parliament, among other problems that arose. That's oversimplifying it. But this is kind of the summary of no taxation without representation. Remember that whole expression? So this leads directly to the American Revolutionary War, right? See how that works? So this is one of the main reasons that we declared independence way back when, was because we didn't want to pay taxes. There's more to it than that, though. For instance, there was a cultural difference. There was this idea we were pretty much already ruling ourselves, so why are we even part of England anymore? Not to mention there was a big pressure to keep expanding. And England didn't want that because they had to keep fighting Native Americans, and that was an expense. That's the military. It's like, this guy's just paying peace. It's fine. So we have this whole parallel we couldn't pass, and basically there's all kinds of problems. So what happens is the revolution gets underway, and of course we know how that story goes. What's interesting is that wasn't the only real test of independence. Later on, in 1811, another war broke out between the U.S., Great Britain, and the Native Americans, known as the War of 1812. Now, if you're in Europe, they tend to focus on this as part of the Napoleonic Wars, which is a much larger war that we're not really going to go into right now. But in North America, the War of 1812 is what we tend to look at, and it tends to be really confusing. And the reason is that we're really not sure who won. Even to this day, we really don't know. If you ask the Canadians, they'll tend to probably say that they won the war. If you ask Americans and they actually, A, know what you're talking about, they will likely, B, say, yeah, we won that war. In England, they're just kind of like, it happens. Here's a map that shows what we were talking about with Canada, and specifically the territories controlled by each side. The important thing to know, though, about the French and Indian War is that what happened is everything along the St. Lawrence was French, the St. Lawrence River. Everything around the area of New York was Dutch, and then everything south of that was English. And that the English were seeking to get land, the French were seeking fur. And that kind of sets the stage for everything. All right, so how do we determine who wins a war? Well, in military terms, we talk about objectives. What was the point? What were we trying to achieve from this? And so we can kind of figure this out. The British were trying to keep Canada from being invaded by the United States. Yes, that was our goal at one point, was to, quote-unquote, liberate the Canadians. We have this idea of manifest destiny, that God's will was that the U.S. would stretch from sea to shining sea, and we would add all this lovely territory to our country. But the thing is, Canada was pretty much loyal to the crown. We had this envision when we were invading Canada that we would invade and that people would rise in revolution against the British and the people loyalists. Except the problem was they were loyalists. If you guys have studied the American Revolution, you know that not everyone in the colonies wanted to break free from England. You had a number of people who were loyal to the crown. And when the rebels won, they didn't want to stick around because that would be really hostile. So they moved north for the most part into Canada. And so you have this nation of loyalists, essentially. So that was an epic fail. So Britain wanted to keep the U.S. from invading Canada. And then also, if they could, to reassert control over the lost colonies in the United States. Now, as the U.S. is concerned, one of the reasons we got in the war was because Britain was busy fighting Napoleon. The thing they had to worry and rely on was the use of ships. Their navy was always been England's strong suit. And, well, not always, but for the period of time we're talking about for sure. Anyhow. They were trying to prevent British from attacking American ships. Basically what happened was Napoleon was trying to starve Britain's economy and so blockaded all of their trade. England responded by doing the same thing for French trade. So basically, both France and England said, if anyone tries to trade with my enemy, we're going to take over your ship. So that was really annoying to us because we weren't involved in the war. We were trying to trade with both France and England and kept having our ships seized. Now, what really annoyed us was that England had this habit of impressing sailors. Basically, what this was is you go and you find sailors who are English, and force them to serve in your navy. Imagine this for a second. If you're on a cruise ship and suddenly another ship pulls alongside and forces a gun into your hands and says, right, you're in our navy now. I mean, it's a little hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? But this absolutely happened, and we essentially saw it as slavery, as forced slavery on American citizens. So we were pretty upset about this. So we wanted to prevent that from happening. Secondly, we wanted to, quote-unquote, liberate Canada, i.e. invade, and add it to the United States. And three, to stop the British from meddling in North America. You see, the British, as it said, wanted to add the American colonies back into its territory. So one of the ways it saw it could do this was by giving weapons and ammunition to Native American tribes who we were fighting against in the frontier. So the whole idea here is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we want to stop them from doing that. Lastly, the native tribes, they actually had objectives of their own beyond just fighting the Americans. You see, they wanted to gain American territories that they had lost to the Americans, that they saw as unfair, and also to unify the tribes. Now, this almost happened. A dude named Tecumseh came very, very close and actually succeeded in unifying a number of tribes. But what happened is his brother, whose name I can't even begin to pronounce, but his nickname was the Prophet, because he was a priest, essentially. Sought to help his brother, but became too antsy and ended up jumping the gun. See, what happened is, over by the town of Prophetstown, which is in northern Indiana, a U.S. Army led by William Henry Harrison was basically right outside the town. And so Tecumseh said to his brother, if you keep them here, I'm going to go get all of our allies, and we can crush this army. So Tecumseh leaves to go get all these guys to help out, and the Prophet basically doesn't wait for his brother to get back. He ends up issuing a sneak attack, because he's like, we outnumber these guys 4-1, it'll be fine. Not counting on the fact that natives didn't fight like Americans did. He didn't do things the way he should have done, essentially. So what happened is on November, think about this for a second, November 7th, 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe went down. And basically, what had happened is there was a sneak attack at night, and initially the natives were winning, but things went downside pretty quickly, and the Americans ended up pushing back the natives and didn't destroy the army, but broke their morale. So they ended up running away, and then after a few days, the American army burned the town of Prophetstown to the ground. And so when Tecumseh made it back, his army was destroyed, and basically from that point on, he was at a disadvantage. And then a number of years later, in the War of 1812, Tecumseh himself was killed. I believe it was at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And from that point on, the dream of the unified Indian nation collapsed. So, in order for us to determine who wins the war, we have to see who achieved whose objectives. So let's start with Great Britain. Did they keep Canada from being invaded by the United States? Yes, they did. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean we didn't take Canadian territories. We did. But so did Canada. Canada ended up actually counterattacking and took American territories. In fact, the Canadian forces, technically it was the British, it was a regiment of British troops in Canada, burned the White House to the ground. So what happened there is, at the end of the war, we basically said, let's just pretend this never happened, and we gave them their territories back, and they gave ours back, and we have this border that we still have today. So yes, they did that successfully. Did they reassert control over the colonies? No, they did not. So they had one objective they succeeded at, and one they failed. U.S. Did we stop British attacks on American ships? Yes, kind of. You see, what happened was, before the war even broke out, an act of Parliament essentially banned the commanding officers from attacking American ships, and just as they decided that, we declared war. So we kind of got that, but technically that happened before we declared war, so that's kind of a... Did we liberate Canada? Yeah, Canada stayed independent. Did we stop British meddling in North America? Yes, we did. Basically, Britain decided this was too expensive, they weren't going to worry about the colonies anymore. So we achieved one-ish objective. I don't really count the top one because, to be fair, that wasn't really something we did in the war. But that's semantics. The native tribes. Did they liberate the lost lands of the Americans? No, they didn't. In fact, they lost more land to us after the war. So peace treaties. Did they unify the warring tribes? No, they did not. So, who wins the War of 1812? Technically, nobody does. No one achieved all their objectives. So if someone asked you who won the War of 1812, you said nobody did, that's a fair answer. However, if we're going to split hairs and say there has to be a winner, we could also say the British won because they achieved the objective, and the Americans won because they achieved the objective, and the natives lost because they didn't achieve any objectives. That makes sense? So that's one way to look at it. This map shows some of what we were talking about in terms of the various claims that was going on after and before these territories in the War of 1812. No, this is French and Indian War, excuse me. I forgot about that part. One thing I do think is kind of interesting, we sometimes forget that all this area down in here, that's with Spain. Spain controlled this area. They actually had soldiers in the War of 1812. They actually ended up having some areas over in Mexico as well. So they were involved quite a bit. This is just an image that shows, to some extent, what the war looked like. The type of weapon. Hang on, I'll bring it over here. Let me turn off the light so you guys can maybe see this a little bit better. The types of weapons that were being used, they were flintlock weapons, specifically these were muskets. Kind of similar to what you'd see in the American Revolution, but also slightly different as well. One thing you realize pretty quickly is how much smoke these weapons generate. So you guys might have seen flags that were created by armies and things like that. The purpose of those was so that in all this smoke and confusion, you could see where your army was and you could stay with everybody. Furthermore, they would form lines that would shoulder to shoulder pressed into each other so you could feel where the guy was next to you and you know exactly where you were supposed to be. Furthermore, they used musicians, drummers, and fifers in order to convey orders, so that when you heard a certain drum tattoo, you knew that was time to reload your weapon, or that it was time to fire, or time to put time, or whatever the order happened to be. But essentially, these weapons were fairly simple, yet also complicated. The step of loading a muzzle-loading weapon like this is involving, just like the name implies, you load it from the top of your weapon. So, traditionally, if you're hunting with a flintlock rifle, you probably have something like this set up, as well as a pouch that has bullets in it. And what you do is you end up taking some powder from your powder horn and pouring it into the top of your weapon. Then you get a bullet and you push it in there. Now, usually, these bullets are actually smaller than the inside of the gun. If you had exactly the same size, you couldn't actually get it down it. But how different it was kind of varied from place to place. So in order to make certain that it was snug against the inside of the weapon, you have a piece of wadding wrapped around the bullet. This could be a piece of fabric, or it could even be pieces of leather if you're really kind of into it. I read a story one time of a cannon crew that was done using pages from a Bible. But anyway. So, once you have your bullet kind of worked in there, you pull out the ramrod and you shove this all the way down so it's in the bottom in the breech. Pull your ramrod out, stick it back in. Then you cast about your weapon. Take your powder horn again, and then you load some powder into the pan of the flintlock. Then you cock the weapon all the way and you're ready to shoot. Whenever the order comes to fire, you put it to the shoulder, pull the trigger, and then you're done. So what happened is soldiers, in order to learn to do all these steps in the proper order, would practice what's known as the drill. So you probably have heard of the drill sergeants or drill instructor. That's what they're talking about. It's learning how to fire the weapon. Now, that's really slow. That's a slow process. So to speed things up, soldiers would often roll their ammunition into cartridges. There was a tube of paper that had powder and a ball inside of it. And so what happened is you'd speed this process up by having all your cartridges in a cartridge box, a piece of leather or wood block, where you pull out the thing, bite it, pour it down, pour the powder in, throw it down, ram it, ready to go. A trained musketeer can fire 3 aim shots in a minute, right? So this is a type of thing that was not necessarily hard to do, but it took practice to do well. Now, you may have also heard that these flintlock weapons weren't terribly accurate. That's yes and a no. Compared to modern rifles, yeah, it's not too accurate. But they were accurate enough that actually, I know a dude who hunts with a musket. He hunts deer with a musket. He's pretty good at it. That being said, you're somewhat limited. But the objective wasn't actually to aim, believe it or not. Your objective was to have a high rate of fire. You had a bunch of guys all shooting at one time, you don't have to be accurate. It's like imagine 100 dudes being like one giant shotgun. So actually firing in big groups was effective. You know, if you actually study history of that. The other thing you might see is on some of these weapons you might have a giant spike on the end called a bayonet. That was basically turning your rifle or musket into a spear. Now that came for a couple different reasons. The main one, though, was to keep cavalry from running you over. Because even though these are, guns, horses are still pretty fast things. If they get on top of you, they're going to run you down. And the other thing to understand about cavalry is that they were armed with pistols, and then they were also armed with one of these. A U.S. cavalry officer's saber is what this is. They all had similar swords designed to this. But these things are pretty devastating weapons. As far as like a fencing kind of position, like if you're trying to fight another dude with a sword, these things take some getting used to. Slashing weapons are not as easy to use as you think, mainly because they require a dedicated slash to get your objective. And so keeping controlled movements is really necessary. If you're just wailing on somebody with one of these things, they're going to counter you and then cut your head off. So this is something you have to be concerned about, as you can imagine. So these guys with cavalry sabers are coming down on you, and the important thing to realize with the cavalry is it's not just the dude's arm muscles swinging that sword. It's that dude's arm muscles plus his weight plus the weight of the horse plus the speed of the horse. Force equals mass times acceleration. Horses weigh a lot, and they can go pretty fast. Add all that force coming down on one point on a razor-sharp sword, they are going to put some hurt down on somebody. So how do you stop that from happening? Well, you get something pointy that you shove out on the end of a stick, and if they try to run into you, you jam it into them. Yeah? And there's a whole bunch of dudes with you got to do the same thing. So these were designed to counter cavalry. Did it always work? No. Because usually what would happen is the cavalry would hang back, and if this army lost their courage and turned their back to run away, you send the cavalry after them. And you just cut them down from behind. You can also use cavalry to hit from the side with flanks. So that's something that's kind of important. Yeah?
Last time I watched the show, and this girl, she was like a fighter, and she went and she killed all these people, and they got her the cavalry.
Oh, yeah. Actually, that comes into play a lot in American Westerns, like the cavalry has arrived. That's because at the end of every classic American Western, the U.S. cavalry shows up and defeats them. Usually it's the Indians. Anyway. This is an encampment of Wedgton. Basically, at night, this is where you imagine a bunch of soldiers sleeping. One of those tents actually sleeps 6 soldiers, so they're kind of tight quarters, that sort of thing. But this is kind of just an ideal of like. This actually pictures from a battle reenactment in Indiana, called Battle of Mississauga. And this would be a perfect timepiece, except for the one dude with the Coleman lantern. I just think that's funny. It's this picturesque look back into history, but there's dude with the Coleman lantern, right? All right, so the other thing to understand is that both countries, both the U.S. and Canada, are nations of immigrants. This map shows this pretty darn well. What I think is fascinating, though, is you see all this light blue? That's all German. There's a significant amount of German settlers in the U.S. Of course, if we look to the southwest, we've got lots of folks from Mexico, and as well as other Latino countries. You also have a significant number of African Americans. And then down here in the central area of Kentucky, you have just mixed. Essentially, we have no idea. It's so mixed of different groups that makes up a whole different group of parts. But other similarities. We have been economic partners since 2009 in the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. How much does this affect us? Well, as of, I believe this is 2013, 20% of Canada's GDP is the U.S. So 20% of every dollar that Canada makes is from the U.S. 70% of all goods and services that Canada produces ends up in the U.S. That's just astronomical. So it greatly influences us both. And we, of course, are influenced by that. One of the things I find kind of ironic is, do you guys know which country the U.S. imports most of its crude oil from? Canada, by a significant majority. It's really quite fascinating because for the longest time, when I asked people this question, they'd say, "Oh, it's the Middle East. You know, it's these countries like we're at war with." I said, "No, it has absolutely nothing to do with it. Oil is not the reason we became involved in those nations. Not so much." So anyways, these are just some of the similarities. I'll give you a couple seconds to finish this up, and then we're going to move on to slides. We've got to talk about, of course, the differences. But anyhow, all these are kind of interesting things. But I find the War of 1812 kind of an interesting subject because we tend not talk about that much in the U.S. It's not so much because we're trying to hide anything, I find, but because if you think about it, if we talk about American wars, you're probably thinking the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. Yeah, those tend to be the biggies that we focus on. It's just, you know, the Civil War is very, very, very dramatic versus what could be seen as the Revolution Part 2. Yeah. It's a reproduction. It is a real weapon. Like it's the real deal. It's not sharpened, but it doesn't have to be. It's still a big chunk of iron. But that was actually made by Goodwin in the 1970s. It's for reenactment purposes. It's not meant to hurt people, but keep in mind it's still a weapon, so it still needs to have the same respect to it, if that makes any sense. That rifle over there is also a real weapon, but it cannot possibly fire. It actually lacks one of the key ingredients, namely a hammer. So there's no way for it to actually produce a spark. That's actually though a catwalk, it's not a flintlock, so it can't. It's not exactly the same, just for demonstration purposes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I used to be the captain of a militia company, but then I had kids and stopped doing all that mess. So now I just do civilian stuff. All right, so let's talk the U.S. and some of its regional stuff. Differences. So the thing we often forget about, I think, don't write it just down, don't worry about it. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Sign out, please. The thing we forget about sometimes is that we are actually a nation of regions, too. And there's cultural differences from that. Not only how we speak, but also foods and things like that. How they develop, we've talked about that a little bit. But the other thing is sports. I don't know if you guys quite realize, but like in different areas in the United States, different sports reign supreme. For instance, what sport is most popular in Kentucky? No, I wouldn't say football. I mean, we do watch basketball reign supreme. If you think about it, not so much because of like of the professional, but if we talk collegiate, oh my goodness, people go crazy over college basketball in the States, which, you know, for good reason. UK, and they're, how many champions do they have now? I don't really care about sports, to be honest. I think it's like 6 or something. No, I'm being serious. I mean, if you think about it, it's not the most because UCLA has the most, but it's still pretty high, you know, and especially regionally. Football will be number 2, I'd say. If you go farther north, what sport do people like to play a lot? Football is pretty high up there, but so is hockey. You know, right? Right? Human environment interaction, yeah. I thought it was funny in San Jose hockey. Just Florida. But also, of course, baseball is seen as the American sport, which is funny because I don't know that many people who actually like baseball. Good on you. If you look at food, though, this is tend to be what people focus on in terms of the kind of ironic sort of foods. You know, like the bison but some of that also informs some reality, I should think. You think about the whole genre of Tex-Mex, you know, Mexican food. Hell, you can have people argue over days over what constitutes chili. You know, whether it's got beans or not, and all this nonsense.
Little cornbread and barbecue nation. That
Right.
sounds like the best nation food.
Right?
Right? Like what is cheese on?
We talked about that, didn't we? Barbecue? Right. Yeah. This map is hilarious. All right, so what this map is it shows the nation of the world, nations of the world, based upon its per capita of fast food restaurants. So basically, the fatter the nation, the more fast food restaurants per square mile. It really is. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? But one thing I think is kind of interesting is as big as the U.S. is, look at China. China's pretty enormous, isn't it? That's because fast food is associated with wealth. The wealthier you are, the more fast food restaurants you have. I remember reading an article not too terribly long ago that the U.S. has been going down in the obesity index because, you know, we're like, man, we should stop eating such fatty food, let's eat healthier. And other nations are becoming wealthy enough, they're like, let's afford all this fatty food. Let's love this stuff. Guys, we export fast food like crazy business. Yes, there are other fast food restaurants from other nations, and let me tell you, one of my favorites is in Belgium, it's Quick's. It's like a much fattier version of Chick-fil-A. But that being said, you know, we export it like crazy. And that's just sort of like a developed nation sort of thing. But anyway, again, food can play a big role in determining stuff like that. And again, you can look up this kind of stuff and what are the main differences. There's surprising amount of similarities as well.
Just similar or not different?
This is real differences. So one of the things has to do with culture. In Canada, they have this idea that's called multiculturalism. Essentially, it's you should be proud of your heritage. You should have pride in it, and you should just do your own thing and not worry about being any part of a group per se. So Canada's culture is all about embracing diversity, but at the same time, that means that they're really kind of segregated. If you were to look at a map of the cultures of Canada, it would look almost like a mosaic. All these different cultures kind of isolated from each other. For instance, the biggest Chinatown, the biggest concentration of Chinese immigrants outside of China is in Vancouver. Yes?
I'm sorry, but
No problem.
I'm doing TikTok for the differences, so when this going to Canada, U.S.
Oh, feel free to ask questions anytime. This is under Canada. Yeah. Got it. So anyway, so this mosaic is a great way of describing the cultural differences in Canada. Why this is different is the U.S. is often described as a melting pot. You've probably heard that expression before. That's because there's a lot of pressure on immigrants to adopt to American culture, to speak the language of English, to pronounce names differently, even if it's not overt, like people saying, you must change. There's this subtle pressure. And what's interesting is you can see this in families of immigrants. For instance, what tends to happen is when you have a first generation of immigrants, right, they come over from another country, they're not really going to adopt that many differences, right? They're going to pretty much remain culturally where they're from. Their children will have sort of a mix, because they're growing up in American schools, American culture, but they often will speak the native language. excuse me, because their parents will insist on it. The third generation, the kids born of the immigrants, will basically be American, or they won't have almost anything from their native country. So this is a process called assimilation. That's why it's arguable that America doesn't really have one single culture, because it's a mix of all these things, whereas Canada stresses this diversity and multiculturalism. Does that make sense? Another difference is that in America, we tend to have this idea of individualism, that basically everybody is responsible for their own situation in life. So, for instance, when it comes to medical care, you are responsible for paying for everything. Now, in Canada, they have a more socialized form of culture. Basically, that there are certain things they believe that no individual person should have to deal with, i.e. healthcare. So, for instance, if you are injured in the United States, you are responsible for paying your medical bills. If you do not have insurance, you have to pay for all of it, which can be quite expensive, obviously. But only you are being charged. Now, if you live in Canada, yes?
I couldn't understand radio. Someone was last name Montgomery. Okay. She was your back office.
This is going to be recorded, FYI, so if you need to catch up on it yourself, just go on YouTube. Follow the link from the info page. Now, in Canada, if you're injured, and I'm saying like if you are an American citizen, you're over in Canada and you get injured, the government pays for it. You don't have to pay anything. That's socialized medicine. Now, there are benefits of socialized medicine, but there are also problems with it. And they're not the problems that people who often talk about the problems. Social medicine is a problem. So, for instance, if you have a broken arm, you're not going to sit in the ER for 15 hours waiting for somebody to say that just doesn't happen. But what does tend to happen is you might not get to see the person you would want to see. Now, if you're injured and you have a broken arm, you don't care who you see. But some people like to see the same doctor every single time, and that's maybe not going to happen in Canada. Plus, there can be holdovers in certain situations for basically non-necessary surgeries and things like that. So there are problems. The other thing is that Canadians have to pay higher taxes than we do, because everything the government pays for has to come out of the tax pool. So the problem with this might be, let's say that you are very, very healthy and you never go to the doctor, right? Through your taxes, it's almost as if you are paying to go to the doctor much more frequently. So you're losing money that you're never actually going to see the benefit to. Americans tend to frown on that, saying, well, why should I have to pay for something that I'm not getting a benefit for? You can see this also with schooling. I've seen people all the time who are maybe childless say, well, why should I have to pay for schooling when I'm never going to use it? Okay.
And you got them to school.
Well, it's more like if you don't have any kids, you're not going to be sending kids to school. Does that make sense?
Oh.
That's kind of their argument. Yeah, but it's taken out of your tax money, right? So you are paying for it, which actually is a fallacious statement because you are paying for it. The government is. It's just using your taxes. This is where the whole debate stems from, and we're not trying to get into this right now, but that's what I'm trying to get to. That's the difference. We as Americans tend to be individualistic and say, well, why should I have to pay for something I'm not going to use? Whereas Canadians would say, well, we don't want to have anybody go without medical care, so let's just all pay for it. It's very kind of like group versus individual. The last thing, I'll explain this and then we'll call it a day. But you got to wrote it down. The government in the U.S. tends to be much more conservative than it is in the U.S. You guys, do you know what the difference between a liberal and a conservative is? Okay, conservatism is actually, it could be considered cautious. You don't want to change a lot of things. That's what the word means. What it tends to apply in the U.S. is this sort of right-wing relationship. Right being tend to be focused on religion and tend to be focused on quote-unquote old-fashioned values, tend to focus on a more specific usage of small government, basically. Liberal's the opposite. Have a good day, guys. That's what happens when I run out of time.